I believe that you have seen the program already, and as you know, we have 3 different papers today for the very first panel of the day, and you will have 15 minutes each for presenting your papers. Then our chair, Joe Shaw, for today will comment on your papers, and then you will react to the comments, and then we will follow with a question and answer session. So please feel free to add your comments or any questions in the chat box or raise your hand during the question and answer session. Also, I will ask you for muting your microphones unless you are speaking, commenting, or giving your questions or presenting. And we are, as you know, recording the sessions, and all the recordings will be provided in our channel. We will inform you about it in the due time. Now I think we can start with the very first paper with Madhavi and Wenjuan. So welcome again, and I hope that you will all enjoy the event. Thank you again for being here. Floor is yours, Madhavi and Wenjuan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you also the Professor Joe and all other colleagues here. Today, Professor Madhavi and I are going to present our research which focuses on the constitutional governance values and globalization. We take India and China as our cases for the comparison. Sorry, I just closed the door. Okay, so I know most of you have not read the paper and also may not be familiar with the Indian Chinese context. So we try to share a structured presentation. I will begin with the research design. We try to borrow the research methodology from social science. It's the case study. We selected India and China as 2 different cases. Some of you may see India and China share some similarities in terms of the biggest population, long civilization, and also non-Western culture. But if we zoom in, we will find they are very different in terms of culture, social structure. More importantly, is about their constitutional governance. India is more toward a liberal democracy, while China is an outlier for the kind of liberal constitutionalism. So our research goal is to get some causal inference by comparing these 2 different cases. So our research question actually focuses on 2 parts. One is how the foundational constitutional governance values really influence the transformation of the constitution. And second is what kind of causal inference we can get through compare the 2 cases. So we defined some key terms for our research. You may find that there's some slight difference between this version and the version we have submitted the abstract. We use constitutional governance values instead of cultural identity. So there are lots of literature and very few comments on how to define that. So we try to define it through 3 parameters. First is the guiding ideology of foundational core constitutional values. And second is the institutional logic for the state power arrangement. And the third is citizen-state relationship, mainly for the scope of rights. The second is constitutional transformation, mainly maybe used for informal or formal way. We try to refer to here at both formal and informal way, but for the degree, mainly focus on the substantiality, like which resulting in the reordering of values, norms, or institutions. So now I move to the Chinese part. Chinese constitutional journey actually pretty turbulent. From the first constitution in 1954, and then we have rewriting the constitution 4 times. The current constitution in use is 1982. It's pretty revolutionary. You can see compared to the previous ones. But in terms of the core constitutional values and principles have been kept. The first is China is a socialist state, which clearly mentioned in the constitution, both in the preamble and in the general principles, which also further emphasize and the guiding ideology of contextualize the Marxism and the Leninism, which also mentioned in the preamble. In the 2018 revision, actually also added that the leadership of Communist Party of China is the defining nature of the socialism in China. And the second is the institutional logic for horizontal power and vertical power can be summarized as democratic centralism. And for the horizontal power, you will see Chinese all power constituted on the National People's Congress. And for others, executive or judiciary are treated as functions which are subordinate to the National People's Congress. For the central and the local relationship, it has never mentioned federalism, but it's very dynamic, actually. Some scholars frame Chinese central-local relationship as market-preserving federalism, and some frame it as grassroots democracy plus vertical meritocracy. But generally, the scholars agree that the Chinese political resilience actually heavily rely on the dynamics of a central-local relationship. As to the state-citizen relationship, Chinese constitution has actually combined fundamental rights and fundamental duties together. So the structure is not like a power right. It's more like power right. It's power right and duties. And also Chinese constitution give more focus on the social economic rights than civil and political rights. Next slide, please. Yeah. For the Chinese constitutional transformation since 1982, you can see it's mainly through top to down, through constitutional amendments. There are 5 times of revision with which resulted in 52 constitutional amendments. But if you look at the right part, the majority of the constitution revision focus on the preamble and the general principles. So that's why we call the content is very revolutionary. You can see it's change the planning economy into market economy. Is also bring rule of law and human rights into the Chinese constitution. And it's like open the space for private economy and increase the protection of private property. So from this sense, it's more toward universalism. There are also bottom-up moments which try to push the constitutional actualization from the individual perspective. It can be categorized into 3. First is the judicialization, like a Qilin case. And the second is try to activating the constitutionality review in the constitution designed like a Zhenjigang case. And also there are various administrative litigations against for the anti-discrimination. And there are also very vibrant debates about, the kind of socialism redefinition, like the protection of private property. So we can summarize the Chinese constitution transformation into 3 reflections. The first is the enforcement actually pretty abstract. It's through collective, institutionalization, like the National People's Congress or National People's Congress Standing Committee. Basically, it's through the legislation to actualize the constitution. And then for the interpretation, also given the legislature, and also the supervision of the constitution enforcement also given the legislature. So it's more like, a political document for the ruling party instead of, binding super law for the citizens. And second is the revolutionary content create opportunities for China to redirect the economic development, but it's also created challenges for the normal constitutional order. You think about the rule of law, because the revolution makes unpredictable for the daily life. And the last thing is the constitutional supervision actually has been, it's different from the constitutional review, but to some extent it's like that, but it's designed very weakly. And also because the turbulent and also the revolutionary transformation, which makes the constitutionality review as very challenging. So that's why it's pretty weak in the past several years, but after 2013, the constitutional order is much more normalized. So there are some emerging efforts to strengthen it. So I will stop here and I give the floor to my colleague Madhavi to introduce the Indian part and also a comparative analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So as we can see, the main drivers of constitutional transformation in India have been constitutional amendments as well as the jurisprudence of the Indian Supreme Court. And we can derive the foundational values and principles based on three things. First of all, the guiding ideology from the preamble, which embraces liberal political values like equality, liberty, fraternity, and the directive principles of state policy, which embrace socio-economic principles. And the institutional arrangements can be derived from Part 5 and 6, as well as the 7th schedule, which sets out the vertical distribution of powers between the union and the states, and between the horizontal distribution between the different branches of government. And thirdly, we have the citizen-state relationship, which is laid out in the fundamental rights, which we can find in Chapter 3 of the Constitution, and which focuses on civil, political, and cultural rights. So I wanted to show you a couple of charts which can really explain constitutional transformation in India. So chart 2 looks at the trends of constitutional amendments, which correlates with the parameters that we just identified for constitutional governance, such as institutional arrangements and citizens' rights. And chart 3 looks at the relationship between political stability, that is one party in power versus multi-party coalitions, and the number of amendments passed. And that brings us to our first reflection on constitutional transformation in India, which is about the relationship between the one-party political domination and the substantive content of amendments. So naturally, I think we'd assume that far fewer amendments should be passed during 1989 to 2013, because there are extremely politically unstable times with multiple coalition governments. But these charts actually show there's very little change in the pace of amendments compared to the pace during one-party domination. But not all amendments are substantively important from the perspective of constitutional governance. Looking back at chart 2, during one-party rule, we can see an upward trend of amendments which affects the institutional arrangements or which reorder the citizen-state relationship and the other parameters. On the other hand, during the admittedly less stable multi-party rule, we can categorize most of the amendments into three. The first being low-stakes technical amendments, which are intended to ease pervasive governance issues. So there's almost unanimous political consensus, and it isn't a major part of the public consciousness. So for example, an amendment to give official language status to certain tribal languages. The second is high-stakes amendments on issues which have gained such widespread public acceptance that no political party can afford to really publicly oppose it. So for example, including the right to education as a fundamental right. And finally, continuity amendments, which try to maintain the status quo on certain constitutional issues, that is the extension of reservation in state legislatures for scheduled castes and tribes. Now we can move on to our second reflection over here, which is the relationship between the drivers of constitutional transformation and political stability. So public trust in the political branches of government in India reduced in the period immediately preceding the emergency due to the increasing abuses of power by these branches, especially through the liberal use of the amendment procedure. So this correlates with the judiciary overturning its previous precedent and this culture of self-restraint and deference to the political branches of government and the expansion of the judicial powers. So after emergency, the judiciary gets the opportunity to shift the locus of constitutional change to itself, expanding its jurisdiction and foraying into lawmaking, thereby creating what we call an adjudicatory leadership. And also there are few constitutional limitations on its transformative potential. But this leads us then to our last reflection, which is that all the branches of government who work to create institutional arrangements that work in their own favor. So in case of the executive and legislature, they try to continuously pass constitutional amendments which restricted the power of judicial review over certain legislations and constitutional amendments, and also simultaneously increase the scope of their amending power. On the other hand, the judiciary moves from respecting this sort of legislative supremacy towards asserting and then expanding the power of judicial review, which is then used to expansively interpret the Constitution and make it the only branch of government which has no oversight or real accountability in terms of appointments. So although there are no real constitutional limitations on the judiciary's transformative potential, we can see that there are certain self-imposed limitations from the perspective of institutional arrangements. Now I'll move on to our comparative analysis and inference. So the theoretical frameworks that we use to explain transformation and transplantation are not really adequate to explain India and China. So we decided to use Amartya Sen's framework of idea of justice to understand constitutional transformation through the lens of either transcendental institutionalism, which focuses on identifying just or ideal norms in institutions, or realization-based comparison, which focuses on outcomes. So in terms of convergence, both in transplantation, both countries have contextually applied universal norms and particularized it for its own culture and needs. Whereas in terms of divergence in transformation, China could retain the institutional arrangement of CPC-only leadership while still reshaping the ideology of socialism, while India had to shift from legislative supremacy to a juristocracy, treating the judiciary as the ideal institution for enforcement. So finally, our three causal inferences, the first of which is that both the Indian and Chinese experiences showed us that when a party enjoys political stability, it can drive through more consequential amendments. So the CCP could produce revolutionary amendments since there was no true threat to its political power and stability. Now in India, we see that when there's one party in power, they could push through more consequential amendments. But since it's a democracy, parties are still reluctant to enact a very revolutionary constitutional amendment, particularly due to the expansion of the judicial power to review amendments, as well as fears of these amendments backfiring and the accountability that it has to the public through elections. Secondly, in India and China, which both have different institutional arrangements, we see the natural trend to judicial activism. For example, in China, in the Qiuling case, the Supreme People's Court attempted to expand its power of constitutional interpretation. And this can be attributed to the general perception of the judiciary as holding the mandate to give clear answers in disputes through rulemaking, and with rulemaking being conflated with lawmaking abilities. And finally, Chinese constitutional enforcement occurs through legislation enacted by the collective efforts of the political branches, so its constitutionalism is paralyzed, since it has political importance for laying out principles for governance, but little public legitimacy due to the lack of public engagement. On the contrary, India's constitutional enforcement is driven by individual action, that is constitutional litigation, and so the constitution is missing from public political discourse. So only those issues which are considered important enough by people with the resources to access the court are going to be litigated, enforced, and discussed, and so constitutionalism is fragmented and uncertain. So I'm aware that our time is quite up, so I leave you with these conclusions that we've drawn on our screen. That is the imbalance in existing comparative scholarship and the relationship between political structure and institutional arrangements. And I hope that this can form the basis of comparative constitutional inquiry. Thank you all. We look forward to your feedback.
Thank you very much, Ranjan and Madhavi, for this great presentation and detailed comparative analysis here. I will want to move on to the next presentation. So Marcelo, are you ready to present?
Yes.
So you have 10 minutes, please.
Great. So, because I have very trustworthy connection, I decided to pre-record the presentation. It's below 50 minutes, so we should be fine. Please let me know if there's any problems, if you can hear it well. Okay, here you go.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marcelo. I'm a PhD student and teaching associate at the University of Birmingham. And today I'll be presenting a paper entitled Indigeneity, Constitution and Citizenship, the Roots for Legal Authority in the Lusophone Constitutional Systems. Let's start. This paper will be divided into 4 different sections: an introduction, then I'll talk a little bit about indigeneity and citizenship, then I will present the cases, and then I will bring up some of the issues that I've been facing whilst drafting this article. So to introduce it, I think it's important to say that this paper envisages to explore the constitutional resonance of indigeneity in current citizenship law and rights through the perspective of Lusian constitutional systems. Lusian is just another way to say Lusophone. They both work interchangeably here. And how will I do it? How is it possible to do it? It's possible through three ways. The first is the analysis of indigeneity through Portuguese colonial law. So how colonial law, Portuguese colonial law, implemented indigeneity. The second is proposing a legal political linkage between slavery and indigeneity. And the third is by critically engaging with the Brazilian, Timorese, and Angolan legal systems, something that I hope to do here today. Before we actually start with the presentation, I think it's important for us to talk about the questions and objectives of this paper. There are two main questions regarding the paper. The first is, what is or was the role played by legal indigeneity in Indonesian constitutional systems? And the second is, which is the contemporary connection existing between coloniality, citizenship, and indigeneity? The main objective of this paper is, through critical description, to demonstrate that the modern constitutional reverberations of indigeneity in Indonesian law are ambiguous, that they foment the creation of sub-citizenship standards and rights, and that they continue to present colonial traits that mimic imperial oppression. I think the first important thing to do after this little introduction is to say that there's a lot of legislation pieces that tackle indigeneity and citizenship in Portuguese colonial history. I decided to select some of them that you can see here in the middle, that I deem to be the most important ones. And I will talk about some of them specifically in a couple minutes. But some disclosure is necessary now. That is, for this paper, I use citizenship and nationality interchangeably, but the reason for it is because legislation in the period used it, and I thought it would be an over-problematization for me to discern, to differentiate between the two of them for the purpose of this article. But for theoretical reasons, I do believe that citizenship is something broader than nationality, but this is not the place for this discussion, I think, because otherwise the article would be so big that I would never be able to finish it and never be able to fit the journal. So what I want to show here is that after the end of slavery in 1869, Portugal started to implement several pieces of legislation that created a new constitutional subject, the constitutional subject of the indigenous, of the indigent. Indigenous is mainly used in English as an adjective, not necessarily as a noun, but I try to use both indigenous and indigents as nouns here, what I may change by the final version of the article. So what was the indigenous? How could the law describe or characterize the indigenous? The first important law that tackles indigeneity in Portuguese legal history is the Condemnation of the Indigents Act, 1894. This act establishes that were indigenous, the ones born overseas from indigenous mother and father who do not differentiate themselves by their custom and enlightenment to the commonality of their race. Here we can see some elements. We can see some jus sanguinis element, so an element that is related to being born from a father and a mother, so some blood-related element here. We can see also born overseas, so a territoriality element. We can also say here some differentiation, some degree of civility, like customs and enlightenment, like a civility element. And most importantly, we can see here a racial element, which is race, the commonality of the race. A couple of years go by, and by 1914, the Overseas Administration Act Bill, so this was a preparatory bill, established that the indigenous were the colored individual which cannot satisfy cumulatively to the following conditions: speak Portuguese or any other enlightened language, not practice the uses and customs of indigenous milieu, exercise profession, commerce, or industry, or possess assets for the self-maintenance. So here we can also see that the four elements continue to be present. We can see color, race, we can see civility, like not to practice the uses and customs, and this is already something more developed than it was by the end of the 19th century. And then we jump to the end of the 20th century with the Indigenous Statute of 1954. And in this statute are considered indigents or indigenous people of the overseas provinces, individuals of the Black race or the descendants who, being born or living in the provinces, do not yet possess the enlightenment and the social and personal habitude required for the total application of the public and private law proper of Portuguese citizens. So here, very importantly, we talk about Portuguese citizens, and we'll see how it connects with indigeneity in a couple of slides. So here we can see that indeed slavery servitude, indigeneity, and citizenship kind of transition between one to the other and other. And this is possible to be seen through legislation, as is on the slide. So what was legal indigeneity in that perspective? So in the case of the Eleusinian legal systems, indigeneity arises as a substitutive for slavery and colonial subordination. It arises as a constitutional category for the civilizationally unpleasant who transitions from slaves to servers and finally to indigenous. The access to citizenship would be regulated by special laws, as we'll see, which were based on 4 elements: territoriality, civility, blood, and race. And one question that arises from this is, how does colonial legal indigeneity reverberate in modern constitutional systems? The answer for this is in 3 different ways, at least in the Eleusinian system. By mimicking the colonial master, as is the case of Brazil, by instrumentalizing indigeneity and citizenship disfranchisement as a liberation route, as is the case of Angola, and by emerging from the paracolonial with retained citizenship rights, as is the case of East Timor. So first big case is Brazil, and we will see here that Brazil mimics very strongly the Portuguese legislation for indigenous people. So the main legislation in Brazil, the main piece of legislation in Brazil that tackles indigeneity is the 1973 Indian Institute. And this act continues in force despite the 1988 constitution implementing some rights to indigenous people in the country, especially the rights to land. But as we see here, the conditions for indigenous people in Brazil are not the best. And the reason for it is because there is a mimicking of the Portuguese principles and the Portuguese law when it comes to regulating the rights of indigenous people in Brazil. So we can see in Article 3, it says that Indian people are every individual of pre-Columbian origin or descendants who is self-identified and identified as being part of an ethnic group whose cultural characters differentiate them from the national society. Differentiate them from the national society, something that we just read that was applied in the Portuguese case. Then Article 9 continues. Any Indian can request to the competent judge their liberation from the dictatorship regime, something that was also part of the Portuguese framework. So here in Article 9, we can see that any Indian can request to the competent judge the liberation from the dictatorship regime implemented by this law, by which they become invested with full civil capacity if the following requirements are fulfilled. Before going to the requirements, we can see here that the dictatorship regime was transposed to the Brazilian legal system. And the requirements to leave indigenous identity in Brazil are to be at least 21 years of age, to know Portuguese language, just like in the Portuguese framework, be able to exercise useful activities in the national community, just like one of the censitary elements that we talked about, and fair understanding of the uses and customs of national community. So we can see that there's indeed a lot of connection between the Portuguese constitutional heritage and the Brazilian framework for indigenous rights. Let's go to Angola. Angola, under developed arrangements, was able to enact 2 laws governing legal indigeneity, one in 1917 and another in 1931. We talk about the one of 1931 here. The province was whiter than any other colony in Africa, just after South Africa. And the requirements to leave the indigenous condition were very high compared to other provinces. And this would kind of push most Black people and mixed race people onto constitutional disfranchisement, as we'll be able to see here. So the 1931 Census and Indigenous Tax Collection Regulation established that to be distinguished from the common of the Black race is considered to be assimilated to European, the individual of the said race or descending from it who fulfills the following conditions: have abandoned entirely the uses and customs of the Black race, focus on entirely, correctly speak and read and write in the Portuguese language, emphasis on correctly, adopt monogamy, and exercise a profession, art, or craft compatible with the European civilization, or have income obtained through illicit means sufficient to provide the living comprising sustenance, habitation, and clothing for themselves and their families. We can say that's a very harsh set of elements here. So legal indigeneity continued in force in Angola until 1961. From that year, all Angolans were considered citizens until the recognition of independence that happened in 1975. So the Decree Law 308 established who continued to be citizens of the Portuguese Republic. And The ones residing in a Portuguese overseas territory turn independent, preserve the Portuguese nationality under the following cases: until independence of the respective territory, the ones born in overseas territory under Portuguese administration. So they were nationals just until the independent state. And then the following individuals would also have their Portuguese citizenship preserved. The ones born in overseas territories turned independent who were residing in continental Portugal or adjoining islands for more than 5 years before 25th April 74. So we can see here that Angolans were deprived of citizenship if they were in Angola. And secondly, and most importantly, they were deprived of citizenship if they were in Portugal and they were residents for less than 5 years. This kind of rings a bell if you're European and you live in the United Kingdom, and if you did not apply for the European settlement scheme. It just kind of resonates a little bit with me, sorry. And this is the Angolan framework, something that I really want to develop more in the article. Then we have the case of East Timor. So recognition of Timorese people as indigenous was incidental, and the province never issued regulations to govern legal indigeneity. Timor was excluded from indigeneity officially only in 1953, not being applicable to the province, the Indigence Code of 54. However, Indonesia invaded Timor in 1975, recognizing the territory as a level 1 regional province in 1976. With the Indonesian invasion, Timor enters a state of paracoloniality or semi-coloniality, as we can say, with Indonesia. And it's important for us to talk about the Indonesian law number 7 of 1976 that states that East Timorese people have expressed their will to unite East Timor into the Unitary Republic of Indonesia. With the unification of East Timor into the unitary state of the Republic of Indonesia, the territory of East Timor automatically becomes the territory of the unitary state of Indonesia. The people of East Timor become the people and the citizens of the Republic of Indonesia. So Timor becomes engulfed by another post-colonial state. And it's very interesting to notice that in the Timorese case, it's actually very curious. So during Indonesian rule, the citizenship of Timorese people wasn't clear, and some were considered Portuguese and others Indonesian, depending on applications and a kind of a complex set of rules that were established there. So in the Timorese context, indigeneity or the connection with Portuguese Timor was used to build a legal identity that would differentiate themselves from the Indonesian and kind of pave their way through self-determination. In 1981, the 1959 Portuguese nationality law was repealed, and the territories under Portuguese administration were added into use solely territories. So the territories that were in 81 still under Portuguese administration were considered part of the Portuguese state, and people born or connected to them could indeed claim Portuguese citizenship. And this is very interesting because Macau and Timor continued to be places under Portuguese administration. And because of that, Timorese people were able to claim Portuguese citizenship and somehow continue free from Indonesian rule.
So these were the 3 constitutional cases that I hope will work in portraying the connection existing between citizenship and indigeneity. And lastly, I wanted just to pose 2 little practical questions. One is related to translation. So how do you deal with translating legal ideas and concepts in your work? And a last thing is bearing in mind that footnotes are included in the general word count for GlobeCon, how much detail, authors, references, etc. is too much? To close, here are the sources that I used for this work. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can stop sharing.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm new to Teams, so stop presenting. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. It was great. And we will follow to the next presentation and the very last presentation of today. Yvette,
Yes.
please, can you start?
Yes.
You have 15 minutes.
Have I managed to share my slides?
Yes, indeed. We can see it.
Let's see. There we go. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm getting so much notifications. Anyway, thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I thought it was extremely educative in many ways. That's also my background. I'm a legal scholar, well, legal scholar obviously, but tax scholar at heart. So I'm fairly new to constitutionalism and constitutional work, so I hope you have some understanding for that. So this project of mine, I've been working on it for soon a little more than 2 years, is trying to encompass and explore taxation democracy as a concept. So I think I've finally managed to narrow it down to something manageable after all of these years. So I'm focusing specifically on taxation democracy in the setting of global mobility. So mobile taxpayers, individuals, who may, due to this global mobility, contribute financially to state finances through them taxes in one or several states, depending on how mobile they are. Some are working more permanently in another state than others, and some are working in several states at the same time. Yet, since they are working in another state than their state of citizenship, they are not allowed to influence their general situation or their tax situation specifically, as they are lacking voting rights. What is also interesting in this context is that states subject these individuals to very different treatments when you consider inclusion in democracy and taxation, etc. So I think through my work, the most obvious examples of how these are differentiated are those taxpayer groups that choose to be mobile, high net worth individuals, high skilled workers, etc., compared to those who are actually forced to be mobile, immigrants and asylum seekers primarily. So these two are the two extremes, but of course there's a whole range of taxpayers in between, which I've tried to categorize in order to show how differently they are treated. So interesting enough, in general, when speaking of tax competition, we've seen in the media and in political discussions over the last decade, all of these multinational companies being offered preferential tax treatment in countries such as Ireland or the Netherlands. We've heard of Starbucks, Amazon, Apple, etc. What is interesting is that states have somehow moved over from just competing over these corporate taxpayers and capital in order to also compete over human capital, individuals. So this is the core of my project, how this notion of international tax competition, combination with financial crises and the extended need for additional revenue, in addition to ongoing erosion of the domestic tax bases that people are avoiding or evading taxation by this movement. This has led to a development where individual countries are then intentionally designing their legal systems or the tax systems to attract affluent taxpayers, those with wealth or high skill. And as I mentioned, those who choose to be mobile, while they at the same time are deterring poorer individuals, immigrants, asylum seekers. We've seen Hungary actually introducing tax measures in order to prevent asylum seekers and immigrants to arrive, which would also be one of these extreme cases. So in the overall scheme, in the overall project, and I'm now trying to structure a monograph, which I'm devoted to finalize over the next couple of years, I have this three-part division. So I'm exploring legal coding of human capital. And this is, of course, inspired by Pistor's work. And in my context, in this project, affluent taxpayers are coding. They are not coding in the sense that Pistor is describing it, that you are using different legal regimes in order to enhance your wealth or avoid taxation. In my case, you are coding through, for instance, contract law or property law when investing or buying property in a state in order to achieve citizenship. Malta being one good example of this, buy property and make some voluntary contributions to certain voluntary organizations, and you will have a paved path to citizenship. So I'm exploring this way of how these individual states are attracting and these affluent taxpayers, and then under the, so far now at least, theoretical framework of coding of human capital. The subsequent discussion is, of course, to discuss this inequality that then arises between these different mobile taxpayer groups. Like I said, those who are forced to move, those who choose to move, and those in between. And then to have a more conceptual discussion if it's actually possible to reimagine formal citizenship as a long-term solution to these new contemporary problems that we are experiencing due to economic globalization and increased movements. But that is the overall project. This paper, which is like you perhaps will mention and saw when reading it, I had a hard time, like, am I describing my general project or am I actually focusing on a specific paper? And I would like to write a specific paper for GlobCon. So in this paper specifically, I'm imagining that I will then introduce the concept of taxation and democracy in this economic globalization context and provide concrete examples of how the interlinking between formal citizenship, taxation, and access to democratic inclusion, then voting rights, is factually expressed through positive law. So then I have done some comparative studies. And then to subsequently identify and analyze these contemporary challenges to democracy. And finally then to what is the big challenge for me, so I appreciate all the comments I can have today, to explore constitutionalism as a way of ensuring taxpayer protection as a second best practice when individuals are excluded from formal citizenship and voting rights. So the whole main contribution through my work is simply then this interlinking. And once again, I'm coming from a tax perspective. I try to really just read all the literature associated to citizenship from sociology and legal scholarship over these last 2 years. Of course, I haven't read it all. But I think there is an apparent need for filling in the gap where there is an interlinking between taxation, citizenship, and then democratic inclusion. That I haven't seen other than very few papers on. So I think this is something completely new and something that needs to be explored further, especially with the increased global mobility. So I'm using some comparative examples. So far I've covered Sweden, Germany, and the US, but I'm also planning to include UK now when they are outside of the EU, so to say, because then it will be a very interesting object to study. So I'm using Sweden as this to cover the Nordic legal family. There's this notion of Nordic welfare states being very inclusive and egalitarian, where there is a strong level of protection. But my initial studies show that this may not perhaps be the real case. Sweden, for instance, have had a very unproblematic historical development of their constitution. We haven't really experienced any constitutional crises as other countries may have. And there's also always been this inclusion and equality in general in the legal system, yet we've had some political developments over the last couple of years. We've gone from historically having very strong majority governments to a very volatile political situation. Just last week, we were very, very close to having a new general election just suddenly sprang upon us during a pandemic. So this kind of puts additional pressure on what we've taken for granted for a long time. So we don't have a constitutional court. The principle of equality is actually not really regulated through the Swedish constitution. We've just assumed that there is this notion of equality, but when put to the test, there could actually be a problem with that. So I'm not going to continue to discussing this, but I'm also comparing to Germany, since it's a commonly known state for strong and comprehensive constitutional safeguards. It's also a federal state, so this will naturally have more inclusion of and application of the principle of equality to tax cases. I'm also using the US and the UK. Like I said, both are outside of EU, which will enable additional factors to include. And I also, since they're common law states, they've also have a great influence on many other legal systems around the world. So I'm trying to cover as much as I can for these comparative studies in order to make the results somewhat generalized and not just specific. But we can discuss this further if you have questions. I thought I would just give a concrete example of how I'm then, analyzing this interlinking between taxation, democracy, and citizenship. So if we look at Sweden, I'm not going to go through it all, but I did an initial study where I looked at, as you can see here on the left-hand column, some taxpayer groups. And what's interesting is to look at, for instance, the benchmark. This is a Swedish citizen just residing and working in Sweden. They are subject to unlimited taxation, meaning that they are progressively taxed. Average tax rate on 32% in the municipalities, and marginal tax on 55%. And of course, they then have full access to voting rights, both at local elections and general elections. If we then look at the immigrant or asylum seeking in Sweden, they are subject to the same taxation, full taxation, progressive tax, marginal tax on 55%, yet they can only vote locally if they have resided on Swedish territory for a certain amount of time. And the process of obtaining a Swedish citizenship is quite slow at the moment, since we have taken on so many asylum seekers over the last couple of years. So in practice, it's more 7 to 9 years before you can actually attain a Swedish citizenship. Denmark would be an even more extreme case, where there is this rule nowadays that you have to reside in Denmark for 18 years before being eligible to apply for citizenship, which kind of shows how extreme it can be if you're actually making a new life in a new state and you're not actually included in the society to its fullest extent. Also an extreme case here is the expatriate, which would be commonly in the Swedish case, pensioner who has moved from Sweden after pension to Spain or Portugal, very popular places to go. And they are subject to limited taxation, meaning a flat rate tax on 25%, alternatively no tax if they are residing in Portugal at the moment. Sweden is currently renegotiating this tax treaty in order to close this tax avoidance gap, so to speak. But it kind of means they pay no taxes on their Swedish pensions. They are not residing on Swedish territory anymore. They made their life somewhere else, yet they still have access to voting rights in the general election due to their retained citizenship. So this kind of just shows examples of how citizenship doesn't really fit the reality of modern days. So just to sum up some initial findings, no taxation without representation does not hold true in this global context. Different groups of taxpayers are very much subject to different social contracts. Some are paying more taxes than others, and some are having more inclusion than others. And this becomes extremely noticeable when you look at those who choose to move and can access formal citizenship fast track through these investment programs, golden visas, etc. Even the UK is now applying after Brexit this global talent visa program, where people have to have employment and a certain level of pay in order to even enter the UK. So affluent individuals are able to access societies much more easily, in addition to attaining a preferential tax treatment. And this is what I'm trying to explore as the coding of human capital. So the idea of linking democratic inclusion with formal citizenship is in reality, as I mentioned, outdated. And interesting enough, this month we have actually managed to achieve global consensus on a minimum corporate tax, which was for a long time completely unimaginable. So this kind of tells us that these times that we're living in right now, there is some momentum for change and for revisions of old frameworks. So, but like I said, these conceptual discussions is something I'm trying to do in my monograph. In this paper, I'm trying to be more realistic. So if an individual cannot attain formal citizenship or voting rights, but still pay taxes and live in that country, there is a need for some second best practice. So what would this second best practice be? First of all, why would we need a second best practice? Well, if you're paying taxes, you're contributing to the finances, and if you're living there on a semi-permanent basis, there is some need to be included in society. And also in order to avoid that these minorities are simply being held hostage by the resident majority who can actually vote, there needs to be some safeguards. And this is obvious when we're looking at the countries over the last decades, since there's been, like I mentioned, even in Sweden, this political instability, the rise of nationalism and right-wing movements. We've seen in Hungary, like I said, we even have tax provisions that are preventing people to enter. So once again, how should it be regulated? So I'm kind of thinking taxpayer protection as this second best practice. And this is also filling in some gap in the existing tax literature in any case. There isn't much written about taxpayer protection, and what is written is in majority covering corporate tax payers. And this is, of course, a response to states and international tax regime implementing more and more anti-tax avoidance and anti-tax evasion rules. And then there's this backlash from corporate taxpayers that they need protection from this. So most tax scholars have focused on corporate taxpayers and protection of them. So individual taxpayers like this, persons who are simply moving across borders, they are left out of the discussion. So here there are some gaps to fill in. So I'm in this sense discussing taxpayer protection through both mechanisms in tax codes, but also constitutional safeguards. And this is, like I said, I'm trying to focus on these 4 countries, including the UK. I've already studied initially Sweden, Germany, and the US. And like I said, the Swedish system was not really offering many safeguards in comparison to Germany and the US, which actually surprised me. The US has on paper a lot of taxpayer protection and safeguards, but interesting enough, when you put it to the test, a lot of these are actually restricted to citizenship and or paying taxes. Taxpayer in this sense is actually someone who is paying taxes. In Sweden and Germany, that's not really the case, as long as you're interacting with the tax system or you do have some legitimate claim to appeal tax decisions or to invoke the principle of equality. So Germany would be the most inclusive system, on at least initially, through my findings. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss these details more. I think I'm already over time. I'm going to stop presenting and go back to, yes, did I manage to? I'm not used to team.
All right. Thank you so much, Yvette, for this great presentation, and thank you all the 3 presenters for great presentations and keeping them on the track. And now I will leave the floor to Joe, who is a chair of this panel today. Please, Joe, would you want to start your comments?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the presenters. That's been a really illuminating series of presentations, and I'm most impressed by the incredible research that all of you have done to bring your papers to the Global Constitutionalism Scholars Workshop. I forgive me if my comments are perhaps not quite as extensive as some of the others that were given in earlier sessions. Partly for a number of reasons, I'm actually giving comments on 2 sessions, so this afternoon as well. So I've had quite a lot of papers to read and to assimilate at I'm afraid surprisingly busy time for me at the moment. And secondly, obviously, there are limits to my expertise. There were 2 papers here which address areas of my expertise in relation to citizenship, but also, you know, tax questions and the details of Portuguese citizenship history, if you will, or Portuguese imperial citizenship history, and then obviously China and India, the constitutional transitions and transformations and sort of journeys of those countries is an area where these colleagues have huge expertise, and clearly I have very limited expertise. So my comments, which will be relatively brief, are much more concerned with the question that Jonathan Havercroft put on the table at the beginning of the workshop, which was that, you know, and this is very much clearly the spirit in which these points have been taken by these colleagues here, is to think about, well, you know, what makes a good global constitutionalism paper, and, you know, how do these projects map onto, if you will, the global constitutionalism constellation of stars, if you will. There's a good metaphor to give it. Now, obviously, starting with the first paper by Madhavi and Wenjuan, obviously those who take 2 significant, in population or demographic terms, enormous constitutional systems and seek to compare them are obviously doing a project of global import. But is it one that can engage the global constitutionalism sort of question. And so there I do have some questions for Madhavi and Wenjuan as to whether or not they've moved into a sphere of comparative constitutional law where there is little that you can grasp in order to figure out what makes the two systems comparable, apart from size and obviously a set of changes, I suppose, relating to modernity or post-Second World War modernity and even post-modernity, which have something to do with a whole set of global transformations that we've seen over the years from the development of the neoliberal economy. We've seen changes in relation to the sort of populist authoritarianism, perhaps, which has arisen definitely in India, and potentially a version of that also in China. But I suppose most crucially, and in a way here, the elephant in the room is the connection between constitutionalism and democracy. And as you pointed out, Wenjuan, the constitution is still a very weak instrument in China. It doesn't have the type of recognizable enforcement mechanisms which were built into the constitution in India, and in a way, I was sort of expecting you, Madhavi, to also go back and talk about what were the inputs into the constitution building process in India, which also seemed to me to be extraordinarily important whenever I sometimes graze across in Indian constitutional law. And one of the things that always strongly strikes me is how historically situated constitutional legal scholarship is in India, in a way that then leads me to realize that there are many more ignorances in my life than there is knowledge. So that was a factor that I was specifically missing in the Indian case study. But I'm still more concerned about the question as to how this potentially maps onto a set of research questions which are relevant to understanding the trajectory or the rejection of global constitutionalism. I mean, one of the reasons why we're considering all these questions about decolonialization, about diversity, and so on and so forth, is that we recognize that to a certain extent, global constitutionalism, the very ideas that are embedded in there are biased towards a set of liberal Western sort of, post-war democratic type, post-Second World War democratic type changes that have been that are visible, and we're very, very excited about soon, having a special issue going online at the moment, which is looking precisely at whether or not global constitutionalism speaks to conditions in Asia. You've selected two of the most difficult case studies in Asia, namely India and China. And while you refer to a set of research questions around governance values, I remain to be completely convinced that this comparative analysis is going to is really going to fly, is really going to be successful and insightful and add some value. Each of the case studies is fascinating and extremely well done, but it's the bringing together and the taking out, as it were, that I need a little bit more about. Now, Marcelo, your paper on indigeneity and the indigeneity and constitutionalism in in the context of Portuguese imperial history is fascinating, and the case studies looking at Brazil, Angola, and East Timor and bringing those into conversation with each other is really interesting. As an aside, to show that I do notice things that are in the newspaper, did you see that the issue of the East Timorese as Portuguese citizens became a salient issue in the context of Brexit? Yes. Just recently, because I'm sure maybe you and I know about it, but I'll tell the audience anyway, because lots of people on this call won't have noticed this fascinating little bit of little snippet about the link between Brexit and colonial narratives. There are lots of links between Brexit and colonial narratives embedded in there, but this East Timorese one, where the East Timorese who were residing in the UK as Portuguese citizens had no sense of themselves as being part of the narrative of Brexit. And so consequently, many of these communities, which are relatively marginalized and quite small, of course, but nonetheless, each human story is valuable in and of itself. And each human whose legal status is changed without their input is clearly a potential tragedy, although that word is terribly overused. But you know, these people had not applied to the UK settled status scheme for EU citizens who are resident in the UK, either to get pre-settled status or settled status, and sort of community activists within those communities were really pushing in the run-up to the deadline. And it's fascinating how these colonial issues resonate in the most unexpected places, and that really struck me. So this is a fascinating case study to try to do this, and the framing of it around indigeneity and the relevance of citizenship in a constitutional context, which is not something I need to be personally convinced about, but you might need to think about how you make that really clear for the reader who is not Joe Shaw, is really interesting. But what I lack right at the beginning is a really clear set of definitions. You told us that you were using citizenship and nationality interchangeably, but clearly the word indigeneity in this context and being used as a legal concept which is being developed by the Portuguese legislature or the post-Portuguese legislatures in some of these countries as markers of exclusion or as markers of not somehow being part of the civilized community. And some of those examples that you give are frankly horrifying, of course, to the modern eye, or to the liberal eye, if you will. I would like to see you give us an early and more precise definition, because clearly this is being used quite differently to the terminology of indigenous peoples as being used by the United Nations and so on and so forth. And you need to give us that framing and the critique of that framing as well, because the framing itself, by definition, I think is a colonial structure imposed upon pre-colonial contexts, but also colonial contexts that then change, as you point out, with the moment of the end of slavery, which is significant in and of itself, but doesn't necessarily lead to a modern citizenship regime in the way that we understand it. On the contrary, it's an imperial citizenship regime, which reflects also in the examples that you hint at from the UK and France and so on and so forth. So that framing needs to be a little bit clearer, as does the framing within constitutionalism, because of that, again, that as I've already mentioned in relation to Madhavi and Wenjuan's paper, that uncomfortable relationship between global constitutionalism and other, parts of the world where that framing can't just be dropped down and put in place as if it provides a set of insights that are going to be perfectly resonant. Okay, so those are my comments on that. Yvette, you're also talking about lots of citizenship issues, which is terribly kind of you to give me a way in there, but also tax, which of course, like, you know, like everyone else, whenever I hear the word tax, I always run a mile in the opposite direction. And the issues that you're engaging are incredibly complex and really hard to, you know, really hard to delimit. But the question about the fair treatment of the transnational taxpayer, I think, is an important and potentially resonant question for global constitutionalism. One of the things that I'm quite keen on us seeing us do in the context of global constitutionalism as we take this journal forward is to think more about the links between the public and the private. And insofar as much about tax is not only dependent on fiscal law, which is an area of public law often maintained by a structure, an administrative structure, administrative law, in order to, you know, to control the reasonableness in English law terms. Sorry, there's a reasonableness and lawfulness of what administrations do, so that they stay within the law. But it's also maintained by a surrounding structure of private law, contract in particular, but also corporate law, corporate structures, and so on and so forth. And I think that we can do more to bring constitutionalism into conversation with private law in a way, or global constitutionalism into conversation with private law, building on some of the interesting work that has been done, perhaps in the sort of areas of global administrative law, or some of the other areas, the emergent ways of thinking about that public-private divide, and that could also be developed, I think, a little bit more in relation to taxation and global constitutionalism. I'm struggling to give you any detailed comments, because in a way the structure that you've created is so complex that I don't feel you have now yet quite carved out what is the space for your particular contribution to global constitutionalism. You ask a very practical question somewhere in your paper, which I'll briefly refer to before I close my comments, and that is the question of, you know, what happens when I want to refer to myself? What do I do? And I think that there aren't single answers. You can Google that different people suggest different things, but as you say, you probably have to discuss yourself in the third person, which is a tremendously difficult thing to do in order to pass into the effectively into the anonymized peer review system. So I mean, others on this call who may have views about that, such as, I don't know, Jonathan or Ansher or Jacob, who I think most, if not all of them, are on this call, may have a view about that question as to how we deal with it practically for global constitutionalism. But in terms of your paper, my question to you really is to be a little bit more precise about, you know, why you think this fits into the global constitutionalism space. You talk a lot about democratic inclusion, and clearly that has constitutional resonances. It's constitutionally anchored. But as you pointed out yourself, you know, Sweden is always, in a sense, the counter case. It's a good counter case for some of the work that I've done, in the sense that there may be strong constitutional resonance, but there aren't, for the most part, that sort of typical strong liberal judicial institutions that many people associate with global constitutionalism. So both the meta level of the question, but also the particular cases that you're picking up, and you're sort of, I felt like you were sort of drawing on them a little bit here and there, and then not entirely being clear about, well, this is, you know, this is the objective. It's relatively narrow, and it's an initial exploration of a question that, frankly, I don't, well, others know the back catalogue of global constitutionalism much better than I do, but I think there's plenty of space to develop a new more perspectives on these questions. Okay, so Yeah, and just to say that the whole issue, the whole story of the UK and preferential tax treatments is actually nothing to do with Brexit. It's been going on for a very long time, sort of close to selling citizenship in different ways with golden visas and this, that, and the other. So yeah.
I think the UK example, it's not really the preferential tax treatment, but how EU citizens in the UK and how UK citizens in the EU will actually be managing this transition.
Yeah, of course, it's completely changed post-Brexit.
Yeah. So that is, for me, the biggest interest.
Okay, all right. So I'll hand it back to Aigen, and we've got up to half an hour, I think, for our discussions.
Thank you so much, thank you so much, Joe, for this great comments. Actually, I think you were very modest in saying that you weren't able to provide detailed comments. I think these were very detailed, and I am hoping that you all will find it very useful. So it's time for you now to react to Joe's feedback. Let's first start with Madhavi and Benjamin. We have half an hour left. You can now react to Joe's feedback, and then we will follow to Marcelo and Yvette.
Thank you. Professor, do you want to unmute yourself?
So, okay. I first thank the organizer give us the chance. I know we have a very bold initiative to compare the two biggest developing nations with so many differences. Also thanks Joe for give us very insightful feedback. As you quite mentioned, for how to make them comparable is it's a challenge, but also is I think the contribution we can make for the global constitutionalism. We have actually several questions also in mind to further develop or discuss with the audience. But before I move to my specific question, I also invite my colleague Madhavi to share your feedback or comments.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Professor. Yeah, and again, thanks, Joe and the team from Global Constitutionalism for this. Your comments, first of all, regarding the adding greater inputs into the constitution-making process in India. I agree that the historical foundations of the Indian Constitution are very interesting and also very relevant to understand how constitutionalism in India has developed. But my main the main reason I didn't include it here was I felt it was too great an undertaking and indeed would add too much length to this paper. So I think that's also one of the questions I think Marcelo posted at the end of his presentation, which is how many words would make a good global constitutionalism paper. So I think, yes, that does. I do have a question, which is, in Joe's opinion, or indeed I invite anyone over here, while we are working hard to make that sort of comparative analysis happen, would these be better set as two separate papers? Could they separately make their own sort of contribution to the discourse on global constitutionalism? Because indeed they do have very different narratives. But at the same time, I do want to clarify that when we selected them, we were using the methodologies suggested by Dan Herschel, which is two different cases, right? So we were trying to understand, we selected them as countries which differ on factors which are external to the variables of the study, but sort of similar on internal variables. So we were trying to sort of understand how transformation happens in two different countries, although their practices, their institutions, their guiding ideologies and norms are completely different. So looking at essentially analyzing the different ways in which the same sort of goal of constitutional transformation can happen. I think Professor Wenhuan and I both certainly agreed that more work needs to be done on making that causal inference, that comparative link between the two countries clearer. But that was our rationale behind including that. And I think also in terms of where does this fit into the sort of discourse on global constitutionalism, I think that's sort of one of the points that we're making, is that the current discourse isn't sufficient to really explain it in both India and China. And that's something when we looked at the scholarship, we did a literature review. You know, there are different theories that you can use to explain these trends of transformation in both India and China, but we felt it was necessary to sort of sit and carve out our own explanations based on the analysis that we did. So I think another question I have is how can we sort of communicate this, the fact that we're trying to carve out our own space and create our own theories? How do we communicate this better? Because I feel it's likely that didn't come across as much. So those are my responses. Professor Wenjuan?
We have to take a lot of time. Maybe just a quick question, like Joe mentioned. So constitutionalism is highly related to liberal democracy. But is it possible to have this comparative constitutional studies between liberal democracy and the non, kind of an outlier? And what the possible contribution might be for both the comparative constitutional inquiry and also for the theoretical development? So if you can give us some guidance for the direction, we'll be very appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie and Benjamin. So I think it's better if we follow to Marcelo's reactions, because as you know, one of our aims is to build your network and communication with our editorial team and especially chairs. So you are always welcome to have email communications as well, taking into account our time limitation for now. So Marcelo, can you share your insights and reactions to the feedback?
Sure. So yeah, I completely agree with Jo when she says that some of the concepts, all the terminology needs to be clearly addressed. And the reason for it is because the indigeneity, the indigenous in the Portuguese colonial history, and what came after Portuguese colonial history, like the constitutional systems of Brazil, of East Timor, and of Angola, that include citizenship in the constitutional realm. So these countries include citizenship in the constitution. So the regulations on citizenship are included in the constitution of these countries, but not in Portugal. That follows kind of the French Hispanic methodology of putting it into the civil code. So yes, I do agree that concepts have to be clearly established, because in the Portuguese system, they indeed derive from Africanity, as some authors refer to it, and not necessarily as being native, like in Aboriginal Australian or Native American. So it's a different in different terms. And also, I do understand when Jo says that the connection between global constitutionalism and citizenship needs to be clearly addressed as well, because yes, for me that studies citizenship in constitutional settings like the Lusophone one, it's kind of something clear, but indeed working a little bit on it and making a clearer connection can be something quite positive as well. So thank you very much for your comments, Jo, and yeah, thank you everybody.
Thank you, Marcelo, for the notes. And it's your turn, Yvette.
Sorry, I always get a bit overexcited, so maybe I was already trying to comment to you during my own presentation. But anyway, I really appreciate your comments, Jo, and I think, as you mentioned, and I feel myself, I think what I want to contribute to GlobeCon is like an individual paper that can stand on its own two legs outside of my own bigger project. And I think that's the challenge. I don't want to get into tax technicalities. As you say, I want to link it more clearly to constitutionalism. So I think you gave me some really good comments, and I'm going to have to think on what's the best focus of that individual paper. But thank you. And I just want to say to my co-presenters, I really thought it was super interesting. And being a bit partial for citizenship, I really enjoyed the discussion on citizenship by you, Marcelo. It was super educative. Thank you.
Thank you for all your comments here. Very exciting indeed. And now I think, Jo, whatever you prefer, you can also let us know your thoughts as the answer. Or
it would be good to have Q&A, yeah. I mean, I hope there'll be some questions from the audience
as well. So please, if you have any comments, any thoughts or questions, please let us know. Raise your hands or type them into the chat box. Yeah.
I think there's a hand.
Jessica has put her hand up.
Yes, Jessica. Jessica.
All right. Thank you so much. I find it very difficult not to comment on Marcelo Carvalho Loureiro's paper. I'm sorry for pronouncing your name possibly incorrectly. Since I work on Indigenous people's rights, and what I wanted to sort of introduce here, or possibly as a sort of comparative purposes, sort of the international dimension of these debates, and how the definition of Indigenous peoples as collective subjects has sort of been evolving in international law. And I think that might be, I'm not sure if this paper will allow the space for doing so on a different occasion, but I think given sort of the focus of your paper on citizenship and sort of focusing on the sort of conceptual nature, I think there's a lot of potential for developing this in international law, going from not sure if you've done so. As I noticed you work in human rights generally, so you've possibly sort of also looked into sort of international developments. ILO Convention 107, this sort of integrationist, assimilationist nature, going to C169, and later on towards the development of soft law, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a very influential instrument by all means. I think there's a lot of, it's very interesting to see how international sort of indigenous movements have been developing and have been sort of pushing for, also in terms of participation in international forum, but also very much working on these sort of conceptual issues internationally, and that might be something to explore further. And I wanted to recommend some literature in case you don't have access to, or you're not working with anybody, or colleagues not exploring this, you haven't heard about it. So I think there's a very good work which is also assumes a historical perspective on the ILO regime by Rodriguez Pinheiro, but I can also send it like later on. There are two more books, and there's one very interesting for you, I think, Indigenous Peoples as Subjects of International Law, also written from the perspective of actually many Indigenous scholars as well. It's was published quite recently, and I think it would, quite a few chapters would be useful to explore. Well, that's for me, and I hope we are in contact afterwards for future collaboration, if you can. Well, thanks anyway.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I normally, what I've been using so far is Thornberry, Contasel, and Tayayaki Alfred. I don't know if any of these three are the authors of the other two books that you showed, but yeah, I find it easier to find indigeneity and indigenous rights in international law than to find it in constitutional law. And the reason for it, I think, is because in constitutional systems tend not to talk a lot about them outside, for instance, of Canada, outside of New Zealand, outside of Australia. Like the Brazilian discussion on indigeneity right is actually very limited. So is the Timorese, because in East Timor, the indigenous identity kind of became the national identity, and also the identity that contrasted them with Indonesia. And the same in Angola, the indigenous identity became the national identity. So I will for sure get in contact with you for us to share more on that. Thank you very much for your question and comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for this contribution. It's really much appreciated.
Can I just
there is, yes, of
I
course.
just follow up slightly on that, because I think there's always a danger that we start a little bit of talking at cross purposes, because what I think is, I mean, there are some extremely interesting examples of constitutional anchoring of indigeneity in Latin America, in Bolivia, for example, and Ecuador, and there may be so also after the Chilean constitution building project that's going on. So there's plenty of material there to play with. But what I think is at the core of the tension that Marcelo can of course speak better for himself, but what seems to me to be the core of the tension is this question as to the relationship between a post or dying imperial sorting approach through a highly racialized category, and then the interface between that and other concepts of indigeneity that have arisen and become important, particularly in international law, but also in constitutional law. But I see there's a forest of hands going up, so I'm going to shut up now.
Right, thank you very much. And now, Gaurav, it's your turn. You have raised your hand. Please, you can join us.
Yeah, hi. My question is for Madhavi and Wenjuan's paper. Thanks, I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. I'm curious about the ways in which you're using the terms ideology and transformation. So I was wondering if you mean ideology in a sort of philosophical sense, in a Habermasian sense, as something that sort of, social political attitudes which, distort or purport to hide, whatever it is that's actually being discussed. Is that the sense that you're talking about it? And what are the kinds of methodological tools at your disposal to be able to excavate the ideology? And when you're referring to constitutional transformation, I was wondering if you could just clarify a little more exactly what you mean and how you see the two examples that you have sort of holding together. And someone like Zhang and Tom Ginsburg have argued about China, that China has actually turned towards a greater usage of law in response to a variety of social pressures. And do you see India also going along a similar trajectory? Are the trajectories divergent? So I'm just curious about the ways in which you think that these two examples sort of hang together in terms of just how divergent they are in terms of social, political, cultural conditions. Thank you.
Professor, should I answer this? I think it's a little more towards the Indian side. So I'll go ahead, and if you want to add anything, please.
It would be great if you keep it short, please, because we have only around 12 minutes left.
Gaurav, thanks for your question. So in terms of constitutional transformation, I just wanted to clarify that, I know that it's usually used to refer to informal changes that sort of occur outside the formalized amendment procedure, but we used it here to because we felt like other terms like constitutional change or development didn't adequately capture the sort of magnitude or the revolutionary nature of the changes that we focused on in our research, which is why we sort of used it to refer to both informal and formal procedures. And we've had a lot of debate about that. Now, in terms of ideology, first of all, what we used to sort of determine what the ideology was is, and I think you get a better sense of that if you look at our paper, is of course looking at things like the Constituent Assembly debates, sort of discussions that have happened on what the Constitution is supposed to achieve, and that's essentially what the ideology is, right? Like, what is the basis for taking a certain action? What is going to guide the sort of governance or the enforcement of the Constitution. And that's why we thought actually figuring out what the ideology is important. And that's why we looked at things like the preamble and the directive principles of state policy, which, while they don't actually have any they're not legally binding, but they have a lot of interpretive value, especially for governance. So, for instance, if the government is enacting something that is supposed to give effect to a constitutional provision, something like the preamble and the directive principles are things that are sort of going to guide them in the way in which it's implemented. So, I mean, examples are, for instance, the way that the right to property was essentially read down. And you can sort of see this sort of the relationship with that and the eventual insertion of, socialist into the preamble. So that's the sort of direction we were going for with this. Did I answer everything? Did I?
Yeah, I would just caution you against using because I feel like the term ideology just has so much intellectual baggage to it.
Yeah.
That it's just difficult to justify, but I mean, it's obviously your project. But yeah.
Sorry, just to clarify, I'm using it in the same sense that people like Hannah Lerner, perhaps Gautam Bhatia, and even Granville Austin talked about the sort of ideological flexibility or the sort of commitments that the framers were trying to make in the Constitution. So it also isn't used to sort of impose a specific way of thinking, but also to talk about how flexible the entire constitutional structure is. That's mine.
Thank you very much, Gaura, for your question and the answers, Matari and Renjan. I see Andy has raised his hand. Please, Andy, you can join us.
Thank you. Thank you all for your lovely presentations. I had a question, or slash maybe if Yet could expand a little bit more. I really found it quite interesting, your link between citizenships and taxpayers and how in different countries it has changed over the years. And in particularly, I have my own personal experience with getting the British citizenship a few years ago through that process. In case of Denmark, what is the background? Why have they extended to 18 years? And do you see this sort of becoming in other countries as well? Because I mean, at least from what I remember from my own experience, I saw that in the UK there was some sort of transformation as well as in the others. And how does that then fit in terms of how one pays taxes in the country for so long, but yet cannot be fully integrated in terms of being a citizen and having those voting rights and so forth? Thank you. And good luck with the manuscript.
Thank you, Andy. I think you kind of hit the nail on my own personal question with this project. And I'm originally Swedish and working in Denmark now, which also makes me unique in the sense that you can identify these hurdles that are being faced by a foreigner. Interesting enough, and this is also something I want to, in my overall project, absolutely not now, but how supranational citizenship, as you say, the UK citizenship or Commonwealth citizenship or Nordic citizenship, as we call it, also come into play. For as the extreme case of Denmark, and this is obviously a reaction to the nationalism that have been growing quite steadily in Denmark. I mean, we saw the news last month that Denmark is now also housing asylum seekers in Africa and not in Denmark. It's quite extreme in this case, and it's also very extreme compared to the Swedish approach, which is always like an interesting black and white discussion here, literally, basically. But anyway, sorry. But to the point, what I find interesting is that I have colleagues who have to wait 18 years in order to gain their citizenship. And also, I might add, in order to just get a permanent residency here in Denmark, you have to have had 8 years of full-time, non-interrupted employment. So, I mean, how many can check that box, to be honest? So there's obviously, once again, as I say, you're paving the way for those with for high-skilled workers, etc., that you want to have in your country, and the rest you're basically shutting out. But me as a Swedish citizenship, interesting enough, I can apply here after 2-3 years because I'm Swedish and I'm in the Nordic country family here. So I also feel like that is an injustice in itself. And as you say, then you have to really dig into non-legal motives to these legal regulations. So So it's kind of, as Jo said, it's a very complex area. There are so many factors to somehow handle while still delimiting them, but they do have an impact on, of course, the end results. So like I said, I'm open for all possible angles or tips or hints, whatever. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Yvette, for your answers. So it's here. Do we have any other questions? If not, we have 5 minutes left. I will hand it to Jo for closing remarks.
Yeah, Jessica's hand is still up, but I assume that's not to follow up, but just it's a residue hand. Yeah. Thank you so much to everyone. It's been a fascinating session, and maybe we haven't answered all the detailed questions that you maybe have about global citizenship, but we're more than happy to global constitutionalism. I'm sorry, I get all my terminology messed up there. As Aigen said, there is also scope for you to write to us. Either we're not hard to find on the web, but the best thing to do to ensure that we all see and can respond to any sorts of questions would be to write to the GlobCon email address, which is a Southampton email address, and Aigen sees that initially, but then she can pass any queries on to the editors, and we can respond. It's been fascinating to see the very different ways in which you're navigating the waters around global citizenship. If you global constitutionalism, did it again there, and the different ways in which you're thinking about how how your particular work could speak to this project, if you will, or this space, this interdisciplinary space. I think that's a better terminology. And we would ask that you respond to the way in which people have reacted to your papers and think about whether reframing them, and we're happy to get into further conversation about that. But it is fascinating to see those different ways, but also just to hear that, I mean, as I think it was Yvette said, it was all super interesting material that you were presenting in an incredibly learned and well-researched way. So for me, that was fascinating. I learned a great deal. So I think that's probably it for this session. We convene again at a slightly different time this afternoon. Yesterday we met at 3 UK time. This time we're meeting at 2, but Aigen can fill us in on that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our presenters, to Jo for chairing this session, and also for you all for your contributions to all of these participants here. And I hope you have enjoyed the session. We have the next panel at 2 p.m. UK time. So we hope to see you, at least many of you, there again. So have a good afternoon for now, and see you very soon. Bye bye. Let's close there. Yeah.
Yes.